Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky. Glad to be with you tonight. I'm the author of novels and nonfiction books.
And on her way is Molly Jo Reilly, our producer extraordinaire, who has just reset her computer so that we could get things working smoothly, as all of us had to do tonight. Had some difficulties, so thank you for being patient through our technical difficulties. And here she is, Molly.
Hi.
Did you want to introduce yourself?
It sounds like you were just introducing me, but yes, hi, I'm Molly. I am producer of this podcast. I'm social media ninja for Aaron. I do a whole bunch of other stuff, and let's get the ball rolling.
Excellent. And a reminder to those of you listening on the audio version of this podcast, you can watch us record live and participate in the chat room and ask questions at on Google Hangouts via Google Hangouts Live, or Hangouts on Air is what it's called, at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, or whenever our technology allows us to go live. So that's usually about 6:30 p.m. Sometimes it's 6:35. Tonight it was 6:40.
10 p.m. We never know.
Yeah. You just don't know. So
just clear the Tuesday evening schedule and hang out. It's a barrel of fun.
Exactly.
Sooner or later.
Just clear Tuesdays, yeah. You can do that if you add us on Google Plus at firstsinfictionpodcast@gmail.com. We send out the invites from that address. So another quick reminder to, if you have a question and you're not able to watch live, visit aarongansky.com and click on the Ask the Author button there, and you can ask us a question that we'll answer live on air. And with that, Pops, I'll shoot it over to you for our publishing term of the week.
All righty, Didy. I'm using a two-word term, ensemble cast, and you might think that that would come from either stage plays or movies, and you'd be right. But books often come with ensemble cast. Normally we think of in a novel of having a protagonist with supporting protagonists and an antagonist with supporting antagonists trailing along. Sometimes, however, you get an ensemble cast. That's where you have more than one protagonist. You do have a primary protagonist, but the other people are doing more than support. We're getting lots of point of view stuff from them, and so you get an ensemble cast, and you follow a whole bunch of different people through whatever the action might be. So it's an ensemble cast. So if you were pitching this to an agent or to an acquisitions editor, you would say this, you'd introduce your protagonist by name. I always do that, by name, the protagonist, a little bit about them, and this is an ensemble cast. We include, and then you list those people, where they might be. Does that make sense?
It does,
Yes.
and I would, I'd say Lost is a good example of this. Would that be correct? The television series Lost?
Yep, a lot of television shows are done in ensemble cast, but Lost would be an excellent example because you had more than one protagonist and more than one antagonist. Of course, then you had The Island, which was an antagonist, which works into our setting conversation today, but you had The Island, which was an antagonist, as well as people, and so that'd be an excellent example of an ensemble cast.
You know, I'd actually not considered Lost as using that as an example for our discussion tonight, but we might have to revisit that because you make a very good point. In context of world building, they did a lot of world building for that little island, so that would be great. Stephen King's The Stand would also be another good example of an ensemble cast. Would you agree?
Yeah, exactly. And that's an excellent one to study. That's the perfect example. You do have a primary protagonist, but there are a great many other people, and it gives you some depth when you do this. You have people who have different characteristics. They, some might be smarter than others. Some might have ulterior motives. Some need to overcome something, and so having multiple cast members like that allows you to paint with a broader brush, many more colors. Let's use that as the metaphor here. It allows you to paint with more colors, and can be far more interesting. Now, the downside of an ensemble cast is if the ensemble cast gets too big, then you're doing a lot of juggling.
Yeah, I think of Lord of the Rings, the Game of Thrones series, another Stephen King, Under the Dome. Whenever you've got a large cast of characters, multiple points of view that you're juggling at a time, would qualify as kind of an ensemble cast. So, yeah, I don't know that we've done that term, so that's a good one. I'm glad you brought that one up today. So, but today we are talking about world building. Now, normally when you hear this term, it's used in context of fantasy or science fiction, because in those genres you're actually building a world, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an entire world. For example, you could have a small town setting set in contemporary America, and you would still need to build that town. I guess then in that case it would be town building. But there are several things that you want to think of. This is a little bit more than setting. It's kind of the setting on steroids. And so we're going to talk a lot tonight about things that most people don't consider when developing their setting that maybe they should. And in considering these things, it's going to really kind of ratchet up the level of your fiction. And I know, Pops, you've mentioned a few in the show notes here. You've mentioned a few examples of some world building that you thought was particularly good.
Yeah, and you're right to distinguish between world building and setting. I think setting is a subset of world building. Setting is usually confined. Okay, for this particular scene, we're inside the house and in the living room, and this is the action that's going to take place. In the next scene, you might be outside doing something in a car, in a race or something like that. World building is the whole canvas, and so it would include all of those settings, those local settings, but also have with it a sense of feeling. It really takes the concept that setting is character to the next level, so the entire environment. So, and that would also pertain to historical things. If you're writing a historical novel, or if you're doing alternate history, Abraham Lincoln, vampire killer, or something like that, you have to get enough of the history for it to be real, but then you can twist it. So world building, as you said, primarily fantasy and science fiction. That's what most people think, but it's really in every novel. You have to build a world somewhere for all your scenes to be set against and for all your actors to act in, all your characters.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that we want to talk about, even if you're writing about contemporary America, contemporary America is still in a larger world. So you've got a small town in contemporary America. You need to be considering the politics of the small town as well as the politics of the nation as well as the politics of the world, because all of that's going to have some sort of impact. If we think of setting just in the context of we're going to set something in my hometown of Silver Lakes, California. Well, we just had those shootings in San Bernardino, which is a big deal. It affected the entire nation, and it was real close to our town. And so that's going to be something that I need to consider, not just what's going on in the town, but what's going on in the larger world that's affecting that small town. And we tend not to think about that when designing setting. And I think we do ourselves a disservice when we neglect to remember that each location is a smaller subsection of a greater place, a greater planet, a world, a galaxy if you're writing science fiction, etc. And so thinking about those types of things is really going to help kind of deepen that.
And it's very important to do because the reader will buy into it. When they suspend their disbelief, they will enter that world. But we have to, as writers, make it approachable. So if we get too grandiose, it's too difficult to follow. If it's too confined, too narrow, and we don't have that special knowledge, then we're confused. So it's getting that balance. Let's take something people might be familiar with. Mark Twain, when he wrote Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, he had his settings along different places along the Mississippi, but his overall world was life among the poor in the small towns along the Mississippi. And so we get some insights in that, and then the story takes place in settings in those things. So that came to mind as I was thinking about this. Rendezvous with Rama, still one of my favorite books ever, is science fiction, so it's a perfect example. Arthur C. Clarke creates a spaceship that comes to Earth and is in orbit, and we go up and take a look at it, and there's a world inside this. It's a big cylinder, and our astronauts make an entrance into it, and now he's just got a blank canvas, and so he can create whatever world he wants, except since he writes realistic science fiction, meaning it's based in science, he has to get all the science part right about that. But that was an excellent one. You did a great job in The Bargain with that desert town. That worked really well. Dean Koontz, I'm thinking of Odd Thomas and his small desert town that he created, which in itself is a character all itself. And on it goes. There's just a whole list of them, but some of the best books have this world. Or think of Ray Bradbury in Fahrenheit 451. Even though technically it's a contemporary society or just slightly future society, it is nonetheless a very different world that he creates.
Right, the near future. The Star Trek series, loved The Next Generation, the original series, built not only a world but a galaxy, and with the Bargain, what I wanted to think about, and thank you for mentioning that, I appreciate that, is the influence of the town as a whole, and it's not just that one town, but it's the two towns above them, or one above, one to the north, one to the south, and the politics between those small towns, and how that plays out, and how people looked at each other, and those types of things. Just easy things like, how some people are going to be snobby toward one particular group of people. I probably shouldn't mention this on a public podcast, but I'm going to. I once dated a girl that lived in a small mountain town, and she used to refer to me as a lowlander because I was from I wasn't even from the mountains.
You sure that wasn't low life?
Yeah, well, it was both. I was a low-life lowlander is what it was. So it's getting too close to home now. But, there was that kind of almost this arrogance that she felt she was better than me because she came from kind of a richer part of town. And I'm not going to say she was better than me, but she was definitely richer. So the podcast Welcome to Night Vale, the wildly popular podcast Welcome to Night Vale, just launched a novel based in that same world, and one of the things that makes that such a success is that it is so quirky and so weird about this desert town with a glowing cloud that rains dead animals, and now it's on the what is it, the Board of Education, and the school board, and they've got a dog park, and it's just as a reminder, the dog park dogs are not allowed in the dog park, people are not allowed in the dog park, and if you go to the dog park, you'll be shot by some secret government conspiracy, and just on and on. If you get a chance and you like quirky kind of Twilight Zone, tongue-in-cheek, kind of H.P. Lovecraftian horror, silly stuff, Welcome to Night Vale is the podcast for you, and it's become very, very popular. They do live shows all across the world, and what makes it so neat is that they've built a world. They've established an actual world with, as absurd as it is, there are definite rules that go along with it. There are a lot of callbacks. So they have their rival town, which is Desert Bluffs, that they don't like. They don't like anyone in Desert Bluffs, and Desert Bluffs doesn't like them, and there are corporate influences and secret government influences, and the librarians are all evil and all that kind of stuff. So they've done a lot of world building with that, and it's really paid off for them. So it's another one that I think of when I think of world building.
Yes, sir. Absolutely right.
So when you're writing and you're building your world, what steps do you go through in building a world? You sit down with pen and paper. What's the first thing that you think of that you write down?
Well, I'm not sure it's the same for every book. Usually I have a character in mind that I know nothing about, but the character comes to me, and so I begin to explore that character, and through the writing, the character reveals himself or herself, and then, of course, in that process, they have to do it against the backdrop of a town. So, and we'll get more into this a little bit later when we talk about the advantages of fictional towns, settings, fictional worlds, and those that are based in reality. So, the difference between whether or not you make up your town or whether you're doing, as I've often done, situate it in San Diego. So some of it will be done that way. So if I know I'm going to be in a real city, say my last novel, Wounds, which took place in San Diego, I already have that painting done. That's been done for me because it's a real town. I just had to choose where in that I was going to do that, the time of day and the characters that populated, and then the interactions, and that created the world for me. which of course then is divided into scenes, and you just keep that big world view in mind as you're working away and creating your scenes. They should always tie together.
I agree with that. I remember sitting down to do the Hand of Adonai series, and even before that, the Bargain did a lot of research on the town. But the Hand of Adonai series, since it was fantasy, I knew I had to do a lot of world building, and I created a map. And I would highly suggest this to our listeners. Grab a map. If you're writing about a real place, grab a real map. We've talked several times about Google Maps on here. I think it would be good just to have an actual map, maybe even an atlas, so you get a feel of not only the roads and where certain shops are located, but the geography, the topography, what biome it's in, what kind of. I'm constantly researching plant life, botany websites to find out what flowers grow where, so I can be, quasi accurate with my descriptions and things of that nature. So. It's really, really important to consider these things. And Molly, with you, you're writing New Orleans, and you're kind of taking this maybe to the next level or whatever. What your idea that you have for NOLA is? You kind of have a series planned around this.
Not about around NOLA, but basically it started with NOLA, and I'm writing mysteries set in a particular area or location where the location is so specific that the story could not be told if it were placed anywhere else. So for NOLA, it takes place in New Orleans. The story that I'm telling there could not be told in New York City or Detroit, Michigan, or something like it. It has to take place in New Orleans because of the characters and the events that happen. Okay. So basically making the location a character in and of itself.
Which we want to do. I've often said that a love story in New York is not a love story in New Orleans, is not a love story in Southern California, is not a love story in Oregon. And so knowing that and how setting plays into your characters, the impact it has on your characters, very, very important. So you want to think about that. You want to think about, we've mentioned it before, the geography and the landscapes, as well as the internal places, buildings, architecture. I've often done, gone online to find architectural drawings of homes in the area, so that I can kind of get a feel for it, and I'll pull up pictures of, modern home design and stuff like that, so I can get a sense of how a home is furnished, and how this character likes, what kind of couches they like versus what kind of televisions they like, or if they even have televisions. But it's important for them to be able to walk outside of their house into an actual world with real trees, with real flowers, with a lawn, if that exists, or if they're in a desert, just dirt. Those types of things can really go a long way to lending credibility to your, not just your setting, but to your story as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about getting maps and the like. I've done several books in which I have a fictional town, but they're usually based on real towns. So I had a town called Ridgeline, which is a combination of Lake Arrowhead and Wrightwood, which are mountain communities that are separated by 50 miles or so. And then I did a series of books in Santa Rita, California. And Santa Rita is made up, and it's based on Ventura. If you lived in Ventura, you could figure out where some of these places are. But what I did is I just took Ventura, I renamed it, and then I renamed some of the streets, and then if I wanted a particular area to be the ritzy part of town, I just declared it that way, because it wasn't really Ventura. But the basic streets, the direction, as you said, the topography, because it's a lot of it's set on a hillside, so, and overlooking the ocean, so that made things a lot easier, and made it easy for me to keep track of things.
And when you're writing about setting, you want to think of all five senses, right? You want to think about sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And because we often forget those, we'll say what something looks like, we'll say possibly what it sounds like, birds chirping, but trying to find what kind of birds, again, the specificity, you want to be very, very specific with your language as much as possible. and that's really going to help. So I think a lot of research about your area is going to do well, whether you're pulling from a real town or you are completely fictionalizing a town from the ground up, or you're writing an entirely new world, if it's fantasy or science fiction. You still want to be specific. I remember the Wheel of Time series, and one of the things that made it so great is how the figurative language that people would use. Or if you just watch Star Wars, like, you're about as stupid as a bantha. It's like, well, what's a bantha? Or you're watching what is it, the Avengers, and Thor says, you're all arguing like a bunch of bilge snipes. It's like, I have no idea what a bilge snipe is, but that, I could tell he's kind of, that was a low blow,
It was probably an insult.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he didn't mean that positively. So, but that kind of specificity, even if it's a made-up animal or tree or plant or something, it's still going to make things feel more authentic and real. So I would say really stretch to find those specific descriptions that are going to take your world from being vague to being a lot more concrete.
Dean Koontz is a master of this, especially some of his middle work, which is some of my favorite. That's not to say his new stuff isn't good. That's just the stuff I cut my teeth on. So I hold it in very high regard. But one of the things I remembered when I was studying him, making him my mentor in studying him, was how often he would mention the kinds of plants or the smell of a plant. So if somebody's parked their car in a particular area, a mountain community, he knew what the plants were. Like you were talking about knowing some of the animals. So when he referred to those, and I didn't go into great detail, he didn't do Tom Clancy, the number of rivets in an F-15 kind of approach. Tom Clancy was right in doing that because that's what those readers want. But you got enough specifics to really get a sense of what was going on. Not enough to drown in, but enough to really not only see it, but you can then smell it. You can maybe you hear things going on. Use as many of the senses as possible without drowning your poor readers in too much detail.
And I think we've talked about that before, knowing the difference between too much detail and not enough detail. There's a balance that you want to strike. And as long as it's important and relevant, then it's a detail that needs to be included. And Brett Anthony Johnston says the goal is to find the one detail that's going to immediately call to mind the rest of the setting. And so it's not necessarily an overabundance of description, but rather one or two of the right specific descriptions that are really going to sell the rest of the world for you. And so that's powerful, and that can only be achieved using that specific language. So a couple things to keep in mind as you are sitting down to do your world building, some things you might want to contemplate. First of all, we mentioned the setting, and that's the physical place. I would draw a map for the Hand of Adonai. I have a map for the world. I have maps for the towns. I have maps for some of the palaces, some of the castles, and things of that nature. And one of the things that I did to challenge myself with the world building of the Hand of Adonai is I drew the map and had several locations listed that I had no intention of writing about. And the reason I did that was because I knew that if these places existed, they would have some sort of influence on the rest of the world. And so even though my characters would never go to this particular town, that town is mentioned, and some of the economics are built around this particular town. And I thought about how this town gets its what's its primary import, what's its primary export, how does it make its money, what is it best known for, those types of things. And I drew all that out in a map. And some of the maps I just kind of adapted from online and did things of that nature. But it's important. I still refer back to that map when I'm writing to get a sense of where my characters are and what's going on in the world. Are they close to a river? Are they in a desert? Do they need water? How easy is it for them to find water? And I may mention this later on, but that's another thing that you'll want to consider is some of the jobs. I think of Star Wars, and Luke Skywalker was a moisture farmer on a desert world. Well, if you live on a planet that's in a desert, what do you need? You need water. And so where does that water come from? Well, you have moisture farmers. Like, Okay, that's bizarre, but it lends to kind of the world itself and makes it feel a little more authentic, a little more believable. It's hard for me to believe there's an entire planet that's a desert, but if you got moisture farmers there, then that makes a little more sense to me.
And there needs to be even more than that, the social aspect to it. So you start with those things, but then, of course, you got to people the group. You got to put some population in there. And I remember, I think it was Stephen King that did it in one of his short story compilations, one of his short story anthologies. A small town where if you were a rocker and you died, that's where you went. That was your heaven, was this small town. So Janis Joplin, I think, was working in a restaurant as a waitress, and Jimi Hendrix, I forget what he was doing, but if you died badly, this is where you ended up. And so there's a strange town, and that was eerie enough and weird enough. But then when you start doing things like that, and then seeing what's happened to them, then you get a real story going on there, where the reader's going to be hungry to know what else is going on. Who else am I going to meet? How can this be? Again, we go back to Dean Koontz's Odd Thomas. His is it Pico? It's Pico Mundo, I think, is the name of the town. Pico Mundo. With that, and of course, he sees ghosts. He sees departed spirits, but he can't hear them. He can just see them, and that creates kind of an interesting thing. But then all of his friends and the people who give him trouble and the restaurant he works at, they populate this world, and that's what makes Odd Thomas stand out. Not just that he is not only named Odd, but is odd, but that he has all these odd people around him.
And that's one of the common tropes that you can really do a lot with world building, is the stranger setup, the trope, where they're stranger to the town. In the Wheel of Time series, in the first book, they leave their small town. Their small town, they're comfortable, they have their friends, they know what's going on, but the minute they step out into the larger world, now they're a stranger. And so now there's a lot of world building that has to go on, because they have to learn how people do things in this particular town and how that particular town does things, and the political games that are being played and all of those things. But even if it's not, again, fantasy or science fiction, your character goes to college. Is it a party school or is it an academic school? I mean, is it Stanford or is it, I'm trying to think of a party school. I didn't really research any party schools. Oh, no.
UCLA.
Something. So some sort of party school. Is the main focus academics, or is it partying? And if you're a real academician and you're going to a party school, you're going to feel out of place and awkward, and that can create some tension. And so thinking about that, what is the norm, the social norm of people? Are you in a small town where everything closes on Sunday, or do you have all the big stores that are open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day? There's a difference between living in the heart of LA and living in the rural communities where everything rolls up, they roll up the streets at 7 p.m. So think about the kind of the social aspects in that regard. You'll also want to think about the customs that people have, and we're coming up on the holiday season, and so it's important to think that what holidays do they celebrate? What traditions are observed? Are there several? Are there competing holidays? Is one holiday celebrated by one group of people and another by another group of people? Thinking about those things, what traditions do they have? Do they want to honor and uphold? And Pops, you wrote a book that was set in Ethiopia, right?
I did a couple that had Ethiopia in it. While you were talking, I was thinking of Dr. Seuss's The Grinch Who Stole Christmas in Whoville. And how they celebrated their Christmas. Clearly, it was Christmas, but see, he did create this whole world and this whole people group, and but we related to all of them. Yeah, I did a couple that were set in Ethiopia, at least a portion of it, and or several scenes might be in it. Ethiopia is a fascinating place, and so I try to put some of those things in there, as well as the custom of the people who live there, the strong coffee they drank. And even included something called cat, which is a leaf you chew, and it's slightly hallucinogenic. It's sort of a poor person's drug. And so a lot of people chew that to keep them going, gives them extra energy and stuff like that. But if it were in the United States, it would be a controlled substance. But it's a normal way of life for many of the people there. So those were some of the things I found out in building that particular world, where much of the scenes in one book take place in Ethiopia.
I remember the immortal, well, not the immortal, but the highly illustrious Dr. Seuss and the star-bellied Sneetches. And that's a social aspect, right, where everybody values the star-bellied Sneetches because they have stars on their belly, and those without stars feel, are scorned and ridiculed. And so somebody starts selling stars to put on your belly, and so everybody buys stars to put on their belly, and then the star-bellied Sneetches no longer feel good, so they no longer feel special, so they take their stars off their bellies, and it's this whole kind of bizarre thing where they continue to go on back and forth, but there's definitely some social things there. Peer pressure, I mean, in a high school there's social issues are the thing, and they have their own social customs. What lunch table do you sit at, and with whom do you sit at these lunch tables, and what kind of grades you're getting, and what particular group do you fit in, the Goths or the Visigoths. I guess there's not a Visigoth social subgroup.
That's a historical group. Like R.L. Stein tried to capture many school-age children in his horror stories. That sounds bad. He tried to capture them. He tried to capture...
in the horror stories, yeah, it sounds really bad.
In the horror stories, he tried to capture what it's like to be that age in school, and so you'd see some of those social issues set against a larger problem, which often helps. So really, we see the point. There's just a lot of stuff that you can put in, and you have to give it a thought. The truth is that we have a tendency either to leave it out because it's hard to do, or we overdo it. And when you go back and do your rewrite, remember, allow yourself the privilege of writing a lousy first draft, because it is, after all, a first draft. No one else is going to read it. We don't care. You just want to get the story down with that, and then go back and do the real writing. So I totally lost my train of thought. I just derailed here.
Yeah, it happens.
We're talking about world building.
Yeah. Oh, is that what we're talking about? Man, I prepared for dialogue.
And high school students and the horrors of being in high school. I'm just.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. If I could live high school all over again, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I'd drop out. I didn't have any problems in high school, so.
Shut up.
I just didn't like it.
Good for you.
I just didn't like it.
You should try teaching it, Pops. I'm sure you'd love it.
Oh, no, there's a reason I didn't become a teacher.
People ask me why I became a teacher. I said, so I could be popular. I wasn't popular in high school the first time, so now you have to like me. So your grade depends on it. So.
All right.
Yeah. Other things you want to consider: economics. I remember listening to the Writing Excuses podcast, and somebody mentioned, if you have somebody handing over gold for a steel sword, what you've just said is steel is more valuable than gold now. And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting point. I hadn't considered it that way. But what's being used for money? In contemporary American society, we've got dollar bills, but in a fantasy world or a science fiction world, what else is it? Is it credits? And what is it? Star Wars, they have Republic credits, and they've got credits in Starfleet and Star Trek. Or is it the Euro if you're taking place in Europe? Is it cigarettes in prison? Prison has its own economy among the inmates. Knowing those types of things is going to help you. Of course, all economics are going to be based on supply and demand, and what do people pay for? And that's going to reveal a lot about the character of your people and the town in which they live, or the city, or the state.
Now, yeah, but if you're doing contemporary society, most of that will be known.
Yes.
So for example, if you set your action in Austin, Texas, there'll be some things. That's because there's a lot of computer people there in Austin, Texas. So you have that Silicon Valley kind of vibe there, but nonetheless, you don't have to tell us how they get paid and what the money is and some of those things, because the reader will already know that. So you have to explain what the reader doesn't know, so that it'll be clear to them. So if they're doing something different, If there is a different currency that's being used, then that has to be explained. And that was one of my problems when I was reading lots of science fiction, is that would often be missed, and I would have no idea. What the early science fiction writers thought the best thing to do was give somebody a name that can't be pronounced and use terms that are never defined anywhere and never explain it, so you have no idea. You get to the end of the story of, well, what was that whole thing about? We don't know. So leads me to this comment. Just because it's clear in your brain doesn't mean it'll be clear in your reader's brain. So you have to make sure that it communicates, that it gets carried over to them.
And keep track of it. In The Hand of Adonai, I have to keep track of certain things. So whenever somebody uses some sort of healing potion or ointment or something that's made from the sap of an oleander or whatever it is that I've come up with, I write it down so that the next time somebody's in a similar situation, they use the same thing. So there's some consistency, and so that consistency is what people will latch on to. If you don't have that consistency, then people are just lost, and that's not what you want. You don't want people to be lost. Thinking about a couple other things here. Politics. Is it a red state? Is it a blue state? What's the hot political topic? The Wheel of Time series, you've got the Game of Houses, I think, is this political game where nobody says what they mean. And if you read it, the Game of Thrones series, there's all sorts of politics through that, and bartering, and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and backroom deals, and all those types of things. How does that work? Who's got the power? How do they keep the power? Knowing that kind of governmental standpoint, you've got the Empire versus the Rebels. One of the interesting things about the prequels of the Star Wars trilogy was how Chancellor Palpatine became the Emperor and how the Republic became the Empire. And one of the greatest lines in there was uttered by the sublime Natalie Portman. Sorry, I was having a moment there. Where she says, "So this is how democracy dies, or this is how freedom dies, with thunderous applause." And it's such a great line that everybody is played into this political game that Palpatine has played. That was kind of an interesting concept for me. I enjoyed that aspect of the films. So keeping those in mind as well. So, Pops, the next question is, do we write about a real town or a fictional one? And I remember calling you up and asking you about this. Do I write about a real town or do I write about a fictional town? And what do you see as the advantages and disadvantages to fictional towns?
I've done both. I enjoy writing fictional because I can make the town be what I want it to be, as long as I keep track of those things. As you said, you take notes. And I used to have a map, and I would just plot these things out. This is where this house is, and this is where they go, so I could describe where they got on the freeway and that sort of thing. Often taking a real city and just changing the name of it. There's some real advantage, I think, in doing the fictional world. In my first book, I set it in San Diego, a real place, and the community I grew up in, I mentioned it, and I misspelled it. It was Claremont. It was East Claremont. But it had an odd spelling, which when I lived there, when I was young, I just never noticed the spelling of it. And that or my spell checker changed it, and I didn't catch it. But nonetheless, I made an error, and somebody called me on it. And that is certainly true when you write about real places. Someone can call you on it, or they can say, hey, I went to that street you mentioned, and there's no such place as that. Of course, then you write back and you go, listen, bud, this is a novel. It doesn't have to be. You understand the principle of fiction. Yes, I'm bitter. But anyway.
It doesn't show at all.
Well, that's good. I'm sure it does. You get some strange things when you're a writer. But I've enjoyed the fictional part, and some people have done a great job with that. Dean Koontz, Stephen King. I'm trying to think of a bunch of them. Well, C.S. Lewis in all of his fantasy sci-fi books. There's just great stuff that can be done, and who are we to question them? C.S. Lewis wants a talking lion named Aslan. Who am I to question him? Of course there's a talking lion because he wants there to be one. if you put me in the middle of New York in December of 2011 and a lion comes up and talks to me, there's going to have to be some explaining going on here because that isn't normal. So there's some freedoms that you get when you do that. There's less research on setting because you make it up as you go, but there's more decisions and that you have to keep track of, as you've talked about. So it does. Fictional world has advantages and disadvantages. And then if you're Stephen King, he said stopping nonstop, talking nonstop. I'll get it yet. Stephen King, set several of these in like Derry, Maine, and some of these other places. And then he started doing other stories in the same place, and so he had to keep track of all of those so that mythology, the book, as they would say in film or in television, is consistent from the first story to the last story. So, if you mention an ice cream place, it's not in the third book, there's something else in its place, you need to explain why. So that's the downside of using a fictional world.
And you would be surprised how closely people keep track of that kind of stuff, especially if you're J.K. Rowling or any of the Star Trek writers. You remember, Pops, that old film Galaxy Quest?
Mm-hmm.
Movie, and I love that where people are just asking the most absurd of questions, like we're trying to jump through this particular dangerous place, and you jumped at the wrong time because we know from this other episode that the pattern was 3, 2, 1 instead of 1, 2, 3, and blah blah blah, and it's just like trying to keep 17 seasons of science fiction lore straight can be somewhat confusing. Somebody's going to start correcting the Klingon, in your episode, and that can be a challenge to try and keep track of that. But the chance of that are still far less than messing up Central Park in New York. That you're going to hear about. Messing up something in San Diego. That you're going to hear about. Having the sun rising in the west and setting in the east, you're going to hear about that. Every time I write about watching the sunset on the beach, I have to think, wait, which coast are we on? Because I'm a California boy, so we got the sun setting over the sea, but it doesn't set over the ocean on the east coast. Am I right? Please let me.
Rises in the east and sets in the west.
Let's see. Okay, good. So I'm going to say I'm correct. Yeah, all right. So keeping track of that kind of stuff can get to be a challenge, especially if you're writing about an unfamiliar place. And Pops, I think when I contacted you, I was asking about Hand of Adonai because I was going to have this town in Minnesota, and so I was researching these different towns, and I was kind of asking your opinion, and I think you said, well, why does it have to be a real town? And I went, oh, you make a good point. And I don't know why it had never occurred to me to have a fictional town in Minnesota rather than a real one.
I was just trying to get you off the phone. I was just... That's fair. I love you. What do you want? Now go. So
I can't believe the things you guys admit on live national video whatever.
Well, I'm old enough now to know that no one takes me seriously. I've tried for decades to get people to take me seriously. They don't, so now I just play to it.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
I go for the laugh.
Yeah, you do that very well.
I had this poor student come up to me the other day, and she goes, Mr. Gansky, I never know when to take you seriously. And I said, why not? And then she started weeping. So it was a good time.
Cruel.
I am. I'm a horrible, horrible person. So some advantages there for real settings and for fictional settings. But then there's always the third option, which is to blend settings. And there you can take elements of a real town and kind of fictionalize it a little bit, especially if you're going to set it perhaps a little bit in the future. I would avoid doing this with historicals because then historicals are automatically assumed to be factual or as close to factual as possible. And so, but if you're going a little bit in the future, you might be able to kind of mix it up a little bit. Molly, you were going to mention something about this, creating a smaller fictional place in a real setting.
Yeah, I was wondering if that's what you mean by that, like creating how we were talking about Stephen King created Derry, Maine, for Hand of Adonai. Is that bleh. Okay, let's start over. Where you create like a restaurant or a store and put it in a real town. Is that what you're talking about here? Or are you talking about like creating an entire, like North Chester, in the real state of Minnesota?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. In Harrison Sawyer book that should be releasing next year, I have them. They're in San Diego as well. Took a nod from you, Pops. And they're eating at a restaurant that I don't think there's a restaurant in San Diego named what I named it. But that's kind of unimportant. I don't think anybody's going to call me out on that. But also with North Chester in Minnesota, it's a fictional town. I did most of it. I made it up. But when I have them driving through town, I actually Google Maps and find the actual, there's an actual town that I've based the geography on. And so where there are lakes, there are lakes. Where there are forests, there are forests. Where there are woods, there are woods. Where Apple Street is, Apple Street is. But I've left the larger town fictional because it's easier, so that I don't have to get all of the details right. I can just kind of look at the ones that I want to. That makes sense?
It makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it is a good point.
Absolutely.
You can put fictional stuff in a real setting. So you could create, as you said, a restaurant in San Diego that doesn't exist. That's really a good way to go. There are some legal ramifications to think about if you mention a real place and then something nasty goes on. So, for example, they serve your food and there's a bug in it, and you called it some restaurant that really exists. There's really big corporate structure behind that. You could get in a good deal of trouble for that. But if you just mention they met at Marie Callender's, and then you describe the scene in Marie Callender's, people will relate to that. But as long as you don't in any way tear down or sully the image of Marie Callender's, then you're okay. But you do want to keep a few of those things in mind.
So the scene where my character goes into a KFC and finds a beak in the chicken pot pie, maybe I shouldn't do that?
I wouldn't.
Okay. All right. Maybe I'll take that out then. That's a joke, by the way. That didn't actually happen. I didn't write that.
No,
So.
But I think now you have to. I think now it has to be even a short story or something. You have to write that.
There's a beak in my chicken pot pie. Winner!
Seriously nasty.
Yeah.
And so along those lines, I have a scene where a crime is committed outside of Cafe Du Monde, and it's a small minor crime, but what should I change the setting to a fictional setting then and not get them involved, or how would you handle that?
Any mention of Cafe Du Monde is fine with me. As long as it's not as long as it's not, say, a Cafe Du Monde employee.
No, it has nothing to do with them. It's just in their location.
Okay, so they're not pummeled to death with beignets or anything like that?
No. I could never write such an abhorrent act. I could not do that.
Yeah. Who do you feel sorry for, the victim or the beignets?
The beignets.
No, I think you'd be fine because it's a well-known place.
Okay.
The place is known around the world, and rightly so. But the fact that it happens outside Cafe Du Monde doesn't, I don't think, would put you in any kind of legal danger. If Cafe Du Monde is responsible for it, or they fail to act, or something like that, and you show them as being either inept or evil, then you got a problem. But if it's just the setting, you wouldn't have any more problem with that than the crime being committed in New Orleans.
Good to know.
Pops, didn't you write a book where people are shooting up It's a Small World?
Yes. Yes.
So,
Why would you do that?
it was glorious.
just wondering if you've heard from Disney's lawyers on that yet or not.
No, and the book's out of print, so I lucked out on that. I made a couple of little mistakes on that. I started to use the song, and when you quote from a song, you can use very little because songs are so short.
4 lines.
Yeah, so I think I used one line, and after that, I just mentioned what it was they were singing. But when I first wrote it, I had the whole song in between the action scenes. Somebody yells "gun, gun, gun," it's a small world after, and I just thought it was a great contrast with that. But yeah, I did that, and but however, see, Disney Corporation was in no way liable for that. They just happened to be the setting.
Right. With the bargain, it takes place in Hailey, California, even though I've mentioned before that a lot of the research is based on a real town. The reason I fictionalized that is because the premise of the book is that everyone in town is so incredibly evil that God's going to destroy it. So I felt a little bit bad saying, hey, I know a lot about your town and everybody in it is evil and, from Satan, demon possessed. So I thought that's kind of weird. And so I knew because it was going to have that darker tone that I wanted to fictionalize it so I wasn't inadvertently or vertently offending people. So we are kind of running out of time. We started a little bit late, so we've got a few more minutes here. But I was going to, Pops, you mentioned here that we need to keep point of view in mind.
Yeah, this comes down to the author's responsibility to describe a setting and the overall scene, the world building, which evolves through, is unfolded through the story. But you have to take into account whether or not you're in first person or third person, because if you're in first person, you're seeing through one person's eyes and one person's eyes only, and it's going to be the way they see it, not the way the author sees it, but the way your character sees it. And so it's going to have to be true to your character in those descriptions. Third person, you get a little more flexibility because the narrator is doing the explaining in the description part. So, but there's a little less involvement when the narrator is doing that. So you just have to keep those two things in mind. First person, you got to be very personal, very close, and it's how your character would view things. So if it's a child, the character is going to view the surrounding differently than would, say, an adult or an old man. It's, you got to keep the point of view person in mind at all times. Third person, again, you have a little bit more freedom, I think.
Agreed. You have a little bit of distance. The narrator can comment on things that the protagonist may not necessarily comment on. Obviously, if you're in third person close, it's going to be pretty much very similar to first person, but if you're third person a little bit more distant or removed, or even omniscient, you can describe it from somebody else's perspective as well. So yeah, absolutely keep that in mind. I also say that the way you describe the setting, the figurative language that you use, should also come from the mind of the narrator, or the first person of the protagonist. So keep that in mind. How would they describe things? And lastly, we just have the admonition to study the best writers. Read them as much as you possibly can. The more you read them, the better off you're going to be. So, Pops, just real quick, who would you say are some of the masters of setting? You've already mentioned a couple, Stephen King and Dean Koontz. Are there any others that come to mind?
I'm going to bring Dean Koontz up again in a minute, but the thing to do is ask yourself, what book do you remember best? What had a lasting impression? What novel touched you? When you think of the novel, can you see the place? So for me, I'm going to go back to Rendezvous with Rama with Arthur C. Clarke. I can still see the circular sea, that's what they called them, one end of the long cylinder they called North Pole, because they're doing a very human thing as they're using names they know for reference points, and they had a South Pole, and they had all these different things. But I can still see the inside of that cylinder as a land, even though I haven't read the book in decades. So he's a good one to study for sort of out of this world, literally out of this world kinds of things. Dean Koontz, I recommend. Odd Thomas is very good if you want to see it from first person description, but he's very, very good. He's just a master craftsman. Even some of the stories that I don't like, I just don't find the stories comfortable. He is a master craftsman, except his very first books, which he was cranking out like crazy and learning a craft. But he became, I think, one of the best craftsmen that's out there. And you can learn a lot about creating a world, creating a scene, creating a character, and showing all those interactions. And so don't just read, study. Ask, what is he doing here? I remember in a scene with a guy sitting in an old truck and he's got his dog with him. It's Dean Koontz. There's always a dog. with him. And he's looking at a building that has a red door on it, and it's raining. Nobody does rain, describes rain better than Dean Koontz does. And I remember being amazed at how well I could see the scene and the world that he worked in. And you get the same thing when you study crime fiction, especially the old stuff. Philip Marlowe and stuff like that. You get to see a city, you get to see things, maybe the underbelly of things, because that's where he's working. And so he does a great job of description from first person point of view. So those are some good ones, but really just ask yourself what book really impacted you, that you remember more than other books, and that's the one to get off the shelf and start analyzing. Ruin your reading. Analyze.
I think it makes your reading more enjoyable personally, but yeah, I would also suggest Cormac McCarthy, though content warning on that is very violent and a lot of language in it, so if you're not comfortable with that, just be aware. The Road is a fantastic novel, probably not as bad as some of his others in context of language and violence, but still very poignant, great descriptions of landscapes and characters, etc. Flannery O'Connor, very, very well done, very accomplished writer with her descriptions of the South. Ray Bradbury and his use of figurative language to establish setting is, unparalleled. So
I was just going to bring him up. Yeah, good call on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the three that immediately come to my mind. And there would be more if I had more time to think about it. George R. R. Martin with the Game of Thrones, again, major content warning on that. But really good writing. Perhaps we can find some excerpts or something, some acceptable excerpts.
Do you know how to tell if a writer's really doing it correctly? Who's just a great craftsman? You know how a writer can tell if that other writer that they're reading is a great craftsman? You get angry. Mm-hmm. You dog. What kind of... I quit. Yeah. There have been a couple times when I wanted to quit just because I know I cannot write this well. I don't care how many times I go over this. I am not going to hit it out of the park like this. And then I go try anyway.
It's an interesting... I felt that way with the band, and you go and see a great show, a great concert, a great band, and you hate them a little bit for being so good, but you're also inspired at the same time to do something similar. So when you pick up that book and you're like, I have to write now, but you're also a little bit depressed that you're never going to reach that level.
I admire you so much, I wish you would drop dead.
Yeah.
There's a little conflict that goes on.
Yeah. I don't want you to die. I just want you to get in a horrible car accident and never be able to type again. So that's all. Not that bad of a person.
Yeah, we don't go that far, but let's admit it. We sometimes feel bad because someone is doing it so well. But then what I do is I make them my mentor.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What are they doing? What are they doing right here? What am I not doing that I don't match this quality, this kind of description? And teach me.
Yeah, Stephen King's Misery. The setting is a room. For the vast majority of the book, it's one room. But the story is so much larger than that. So, again, content warning on that, but some great stuff. So, anyhow, we're pretty much out of time. Do we have any questions, Molly, from the chat room?
Nope. We had Maya check in and Bruce Brady, and that's it. Nobody else checked in. Some very little comments. Maya says, it's hard enough doing normal world building. She has no idea how sci-fi and fantasy folk do it. I agree with her. And then Bruce came in a little bit late and said he apologized. He took some friends out for the evening.
I'm just glad that we weren't the latest ones to the podcast. I always feel bad when listeners show up first and then they have to wait for our tech issues. So, all right. Well, next week we've got gifts for authors. So if you've got a writer in your family or you are a writer and you want to know what to ask Santa for, we'll give you some ideas. So we'll try and, on our social media channels, we'll try and solicit some responses of the best gifts for writers. I think we already put out a request for that, and if you've got ideas, please let us know through either aarongansky.com or our Facebook or our Twitter. You can find us, and that'll be next week. Again, don't forget to ask the author at aarongansky.com. And Pops, how can people get in touch with you?
The usual stuff, altongansky.com, but most of my blogging and stuff is being done on the Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference, brmcwc.com. And tomorrow at that site, I'll have a post on unfinished business. Projects you started that you didn't finish.
I should take a look at that.
Yeah, so
I was just thinking you wrote that for me, didn't you?
yeah, I had a picture of you up on the computer while I was doing this. And,
that's big inspiration right there.
well, I took the
What you
inspiration
start-
because I think it was this week. It was the anniversary of the completion of the Washington Monument, and what a lot of people don't realize is they stopped working on it for 20 years. In fact, when you look at it, you can see the line where they'd stopped and then where they started again. The color of the stone is different.
Oh, wow.
And the point is, all creatives have things that are sitting in the drawer.
See, now I'm intrigued. I'll have to check that out. So, Molly, how can people get in touch with you?
My blog is franklyMyDearMojo.com. I'm on Twitter at RealMojo68, and I am all over Facebook with a whole bunch of different links. So mostly go to my blog, and all of my social media links are up there.
Excellent. And I'm Aaron Gansky. You can find me at aarongansky.com or on Twitter at ADGansky or on Facebook, all around. And if you don't find me there on my social media outlets, you'll at least find my social media ninja, Molly Jo, and she'll be able to get in touch with me and all of that. So we thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.